there are very few people, Mike Doherty, who have the history that you do with St. Mary's University when it comes to sports and athletics. Perhaps you could take us back to your family history and their involvement with St. Mary's.
Well, my father went to St. Mary's High School in the late 1920s. He got into some trouble at Oxford Street School, and so his father sent him to St. Mary's because the Irish Christian Brothers were originally formed to deal with kids who were tough to deal with. Not that my father was so bad, but he really got into sports at St. Mary's, loved rugby, loved hockey, loved the Irish Christian Brothers. They were kind of rough and ready, and he was too. And that appealed to him, I guess. And he had about 3 or 4 good years at St. Mary's and playing sports. And he never forgot that, and he always talked about it and about the friends he made playing sports. And he was always interested in watching, or not, he used to go and see St. Mary's participate in sports. And he followed how they were doing, especially in hockey and football. And then around 1956, my brother went to St. Mary's High School in grade 9. And St. Mary's High School at that time was located on Roby Street. My father had gone to the school on Windsor Street. And my brother loved sports too. He played sports, and when he was in grade 10, he became the gear manager for the football team for Father Elmer McGilvery, who was a very popular ex-hockey star and baseball star too. And he was a teacher at St. Mary's High School, and at that time he was coaching the college football team, the college hockey team, and the high school hockey team. And my brother continued to be the manager of the football team until 1963, while he was attending St. Mary's. And he often talked about the football team, or who was coming to play on the hockey team, and what was going on, and how the team was progressing. And I went to all the games, naturally, with a lot of the other kids. I took I guess St. Mary's was sort of in my DNA between my father and my brother, so all my life I've followed St. Mary's, you know.
When the campus was at Windsor, the facilities for athletics and sports weren't available. So how did they compete? Where did they compete?
Well, they did have some facilities. They had a hockey rink they called the Roarum, which was about probably half the size of the St. Mary's rink that we had before. It was just a little rink, but it was functional, and they played a lot of hockey there. And but they would have played games at the Halifax Forum at the Shirley Street Arena. And they had a huge rugby or football field later where St. Pat's High School was. All that property that is open space now on the corner of Quintal Road and Windsor Street, that was a playground for the St. Mary's students. And they had handball courts there and tennis courts. And they had basketball teams, track and field teams. They played all sports and competed with other schools from the city and from all over the province. They were very much into sports there, and they had a pretty good record as in sporting events. And they years ago, going back to like maybe the 19-teens and early 20s, there was a city hockey league with and St. Mary's, Dalhousie, and Kings would have participated in it. St. Mary's would have often won the city championship. So the sports was always very important at St. Mary's. They always supported the teachers there, and the people who ran the university always supported sports. And that carried over to a fair extent here in the first year at St. Mary's on Roby Street. Father O'Donnell was the athletic director. He wasn't a full-time athletic director, but he was the athletic director. And one of the first announcements he made was that they were going to try to provide a good sports program here. It would be good for school spirit.
The Christian Brothers were very strong advocates for sports and athletics. When the school moved from Windsor to here, in Roby, did that continue? Was there an emphasis placed
very much
on
so.
Academic and athletic?
I would say both. The Jesuits did just about everything they could to encourage the kids to play sports. In the high school, there were about 100 kids going to the high school. Most of them played sports. They had good intramural programs for them. And step by step, they provided just about everything they could for the university students. When they first moved into the university was not really complete. There was a gymnasium on the horizon, and they would have been building that throughout the 1950s. At one point, around 1957 or 56 or 57, it looked like they might have to sort of curtail it a little bit because they were short of funds. And somebody came up with about $25,000 to help them, and they finished it, and it was a beautiful gymnasium, state of the art, you know, in 1958. It was with a beautiful floor and the fiberglass backboards. There was no other gymnasium like it. And that spurred, the students really used it a lot. And then and the basketball team had been competitive leading up until that time. And then when Frank Baldwin brought a couple of Americans up to play on the team, and they became really competitive with St. FX and Acadia and Dalhousie, the students really got behind them. And the gymnasium, you would have been in there, I'm sure, during some games it seemed like the roof would come off. The intensity of the games and the fans was quite amazing sometimes.
But when they moved from Windsor to Roby,
Yeah.
the first athletes to represent the school as Huskies weren't football players, weren't basketball players or hockey players.
Yeah.
They were tennis players.
Yeah, 3 tennis players: Nolan, Scriven, and I should know. I forget the last guy's name. But they went up to New Brunswick to play in the tennis tournament. You were supposed to have 6 players to make a team. St. Mary's only had 3, but they won the championship. And when they arrived back at St. Mary's, they got a royal welcome down at the either the bus station or the train station. A couple hundred students were down there with trumpets and drums, and it was like they won the world championship. But it was the first time St. Mary's had won anything in a few years. And so that started the ball rolling. And then Father Rourke and Ken Fultz and Ken Flynn all got together. Father Rourke was big on football, big on Canadian football.
And prior to this, they played rugby.
Yeah, but when Father Rourke was at the St. Mary's on Windsor Street, he was trying to get the ball rolling for Canadian football. And he did a lot of work to encourage it and to organize it. And among other things, he was, I think, even the public address announcer at the football games. But he went to the meetings, with other people who were organizing Canadian football at the time. And he was really a big force in getting it all started. And then they started off, when they got here, they had some old football gear. I think Notre Dame might have sent it up to them. But they needed new football gear, and they invested about $400 and bought a lot of things to help so they could have a good interfac league. They started out by having an interfaculty league with 4 teams. And within a couple of years, they had a team to represent the university. And it was made up of about 70% students and 30% civilians, guys who had played high school, they wanted to keep on playing. And St. FX had a good junior football team, and they also had a senior football team in the Nova Scotia Senior League. And the 4th team, St. Mary's, Shearwater, St. FX, yeah, and the Cape Breton, HMCS Cape Breton. And they had a very competitive junior football league for about 6 years. And that's where St. Mary's sort of cut their teeth in football.
How did Bob Hayes wind up at St. Mary's as an assistant junior coach?
Well, Bob Hayes was the football hero around here with the Shearwater Flyers. Mind you, Shearwater had other great players too. He wasn't a one-man team, but he was maybe the most sensational player on the team. Bruce Walker was another one who was a terrific football player, and others. They were all good football players on Shearwater. But Poe's father, the main thing that probably got Father McGilvery to invite him over to help with the coaching was because he was teaching full-time in the high school. He was coaching the college team, the high school team, and the high school hockey team, and the college hockey team. And he was also engaged in his own studies in becoming a Jesuit. So he was a busy guy. So he probably thought, well, first of all, I need some help. And Bob Hayes came over here and helped him, and to get ready, I suppose, to play Notre Dame de Grace. And then during some other time in that year, Father McGilvery was attending a meeting that was centered around business from the Nova Scotia Junior Football League, and he happened to end up sitting beside Bob Hayes, and he got an idea. He thought, geez, I wonder if this guy would be interested in coming to coach at St. Mary's. And so he asked him if he would, just sort of out of the blue. And Bob Hayes immediately expressed enthusiasm for it. And Hayes, I believe, I remember he said that later that, and he said, well, make me the athletic director. He thought he'd get a little bit more than just being football coach. He'll be the athletic director. And he was really surprised when McGilvery went for it and thought, yeah, okay, we'll see if we can make you the athletic director. Hayes was only about 22 or maybe 24 years old, very young. And Father McGilvery said he practically ran back to St. Mary's after the meeting to tell Father O'Donnell, geez, I think we might get Bob Hayes to be the athletic director. And they thought that was a really sort of a coup for St. Mary's, because Hayes was, at that time, one of the most popular and favorite athletes around here. And he was considered he was the undefeated champion. The Shearwater Flyers said, when they won the Canadian Intermediate Championship in 1957, that was considered a big, big deal here, because there were lots of good intermediate teams in Canada. The guys on Shearwater, of course, would have been from all over Canada, but they were a real sort of a local team because people had been watching them for a few years. And they had about 6,000 people over at the Wanderers grounds to see them when they won the championship, so they were big. And to get Bob Hayes to be steering the ship for the St. Mary's Sports, that was considered to be, that's like I think Rocky Marciano to be the coach of the boxing team. That's the way it was looked at that time. And he came here with enthusiasm, and one of the things about Bob Hayes, he was a great innovator. It was never dull when Bob Hayes was around. He was always doing something that nobody else had done in football, it seemed. The double quarterback system, the new goal posts. He'd even be out there running back kickoffs against the football on occasion, daring them to tackle, bring them down. I've seen him do that. I only saw him do it once, but I did see him do it.
I saw him do it more than that.
Oh,
but
okay, yeah.
but one of the things was Don Loney was Bob Hayes' coach when he played for the Shearwater Flyers and won that national title. Yeah. When Hayes took over as athletic director and football coach, I think he stole or borrowed some of the things that Loney was doing at St. X. Yeah. One of those things that gave St. Mary's a huge boost was recruitment. Yeah. Up until then, there had been recruitment at St. Mary's, but I don't think the way Hayes did.
No. The odd guy would show up here from the New England Saints and play for St. Mary's. Yeah. Bobby Shea, Leo Rancourt. I can remember seeing some of those guys when I was 11 or 12 years old. But Bob Hayes and Frank Baldwin, and it might have been Father O'Donnell or Father Hennessy or Father Rourke. One of the priests went down with them. They drove down to New England and they went on a barnstorming expedition, I suppose you'd call it, and spoke to the students. And for the kids in New England, they could come, it was a status thing to get a degree from Jesuit University. It was in the States. And the fact that this was a Jesuit university would have helped them. And the cost of coming here, and the tuition was much cheaper in Halifax than it would have been in the States. And so this was a good deal for not only for the athletes, but a lot of the other kids going to high school who heard about it. And by 1959, I was here in 1959 in grade 9, and there were all kinds of American guys here. And at least 1/3 of the football team was made up of Americans. And several of the basketball players were American. They brought up John Riley and another guy, Kelly, and John Kelly, and to play on the St. Mary's basketball team. And I think that was the first year that the gym was complete. And I can remember we heard about Riley. I talked to guys who were going to St. Mary's High School with my brother. They'd often come to the house and they'd be talking about all the stuff that was going on at St. Mary's in sports, mostly not academics. They all liked playing sports. And my brother took me down to the St. Mary's gym. I'd be about 12 years old, and it was the night we just watched the Grey Cup game. I think Hamilton beat Winnipeg, or Winnipeg beat Hamilton 35-28. You probably would have. It was a great Grey Cup game. Then we came down to watch St. Mary's play St. Dunstan's basketball, and John Riley was playing. And we had never seen anybody like John Riley. He was like Bob Cousy for St. Mary's. They had Billy Mullane, Brian Ross, Freddie Walker. They were good. They were very good players. But Riley, he'd grown up in New England playing in Boston, I think, and an outstanding player down there. And he just mesmerized the fans off, and they loved him, And they loved the other guys too, because they had seen them playing for St. Mary's before, and they all gelled together as a really good team. And I remember the first time they went down one Friday, I think it was on a Friday afternoon, they went down and played St. Yvex. And St. Yvex were the champions every year in basketball. And they had a gym that was not a very large gym, and it sort of favored the home team apparently quite a bit. But anyway, St. Mary's, they lost like 61-60. Riley got, I think, 25 points. And it was either, I'm not sure if it went into overtime or St. Yvex won like in the last few seconds, but it showed everybody, wow, St. Mary's are really in it now. And the fan support was really strong. And high school kids would come down to watch from QEH and St. Pat's and St. Mary's. And as the season wore on, I could remember some of my relatives who never would have gone to see a basketball game. But after they went down, they came down to see St. Mary's play Acadia, St. Mary's play Dalhousie, St. Mary's play St. Yvex. And the games were often sensational towards the end of the games. And it was exciting for everybody. And these people kept coming. And they'd come with their kids, really, high school sons, and they really enjoyed the basketball. And never looked back. The basketball never faltered after that.
When did the football program take the leap and become as competitive as basketball?
Well, probably the same year. That year, '59 was probably that was the greatest year up until then that St. Mary's ever had in sports on Robie Street or Windsor Street. And largely because, Hayes, Frank had been coaching the team since '51, and he had led QEH to the Canadian juvenile title early in the 1950s. And he had won a lot of championships with minor league teams, but never a championship with St. Mary's. But the basketball team was exciting, and then Hayes came up here. He went down to the States, and he came back with, one guy was Ted Chandonnet, and there was another guy by the name of Shap Delane, and they were running backs. He had Peter Young as the quarterback, and Peter Young was a good quarterback. I don't think he had Bobby Leahy yet, but he had about 8 or 9 Tim Moynihan, Frank Armand. He had 8 or 9 really good American players. The trip to the States really did pay dividends. And then, and so the football team was then in the intercollegiate league. There was an intercollegiate league with about 8 teams in it.
When did that happen?
That was, I would say, in 1959. I think the year after they lost to Notre Dame de Grasse in the Wanderers grounds, and they had been participating in the college league and the junior football league. The next year they were strictly intercollegiate. And it was a competitive league, and St. Mary's had a very good team that year, and they used to play over the Wanderers grounds mostly, I think. It wasn't too long after that they played, they brought up Dick Loisel. And when people started talking about him and his background, and they'd see him practicing down here, nobody had ever seen anybody throw a football like Dick Loisel. He was really terrific. But one of the things that spurred St. Mary's on also was one night, it might have been in 1960 or 61, I'm not sure, but Hayes stuck his neck out, as he would. I mean, he was always willing to, go on to the next level. And they had an exhibition football game between Dalhousie and St. Mary's. And St. Mary's had a terrific running back in Greg McClear. He was a workhorse on the team. He and Chandonette, and there was a guy, Tibby Johnson was a wing back, and Ray Roy. These guys were all on the same team. And Peter Young was the quarterback. But it was a beautiful night over in the Wanderers grounds. They had about 2,500 to 3,000 people showed up to see Dalhousie play St. Mary's. They hadn't played for years in any kind of football. And Dalhousie had a pretty decent team, Teddy Wickwire and Peter Corkum and Stu McGinnis and Nicky Weatherston, Steve Thompson. These guys were all good football players. And Dalhousie were a very competitive team. For many years, Dalhousie was the place to go to see a football game. Great atmosphere over Studley Field. They had their band, the cheerleaders, they were always singing or chanting stuff, full house every game. We'd go over there as kids. But anyway, so they matched St. Mary's up. Merv Shaw was the coach of Dalhousie, and they matched up against St. Mary's. And St. Mary's gave them a real good game. They lost. I think the score was 21-7. But in the game, Greg McClear, who was a great favorite at St. Mary's, really good guy, good student. Did you know Greg McClear at all? Big
Yes.
guy. Yeah, big guy, strong. And on 2 occasions, he ran through the Dal line for touchdowns of like 60 and 65 yards. And I mean, they were legitimate touchdowns, except that, I mean, everybody was chasing him, trying to stop him, but they couldn't. But St. Mary's were offside on both plays, so they were called back, which was very disappointing from a St. Mary's point of view. But it was a really good game. Both teams put on a good show that night. And so St. Mary's had really moved up a notch. They showed, they were on the move. And then Hayes continued to bring guys up. And I think the next year was when Loisel played his first game. And if my memory serves me correctly, over at the Wanderers grounds, and they played Dalhousie. And they beat Dalhousie by about 35 points that night. The St. Mary's were then sort of like a powerhouse that night, and a big crowd. I can remember I got flashbacks into the, that evening. I can remember them bringing Knucker Burns in a chariot. He was the #1 sports fans and a big St. Mary's fan, and they brought him in on this. Somebody was dragging him in with a chariot or some kind of a wagon. But big crowd, enthusiastic, under the lights. And then, of course, I think that would have been the first year in the Blue Nose Football League. I don't know if
Actually, the Blue Nose Conference came into being in 1965.
Oh, okay, it wasn't the Blue Nose League then. Would have been
But
collegiate.
by 1964,
Mm-hmm.
St. Mary's would win the Atlantic
Oh, I
Bowl
remember
title
that. Yeah, okay.
for the first time ever. Would that have been another defining moment?
Oh, that would be huge. Well, there was another defining moment before that. But,
when they beat St. Avex's.
well, one of the most defining moments was when Paul Puma made the big run back against St. Avex's down in St. Avex's. I got ahead of myself there with that big win with Dick Loisel. But they did, when Loisel played his first game, I'm pretty sure, it was a very impressive start against Dalhousie. So then, I guess they played in the Intercollegiate League for a couple more years and would have been very competitive. But then when Hayes was coaching them, and they They played that game down at St. FX in probably 1963. I was out of school that year, but Paul would have been here, and a few other guys came down from Ontario. They seem to have more guys from Ontario than Americans. They probably still had a few Americans, but they had some good players from up in Canada. And when St. Mary's went down to play St. FX, I read in the paper. I mean, I didn't, and I would have seen it on television, but I wasn't at the game. But I think on the opening kickoff, Paul Puma ran the kickoff back to about the 5 or 10 yard line against St. FX. Nobody did that against St. FX.
But they didn't beat Santa Fe.
No, they lost by
that
a
year.
point, I think, like 11.
The
10 or
next
something.
year,
Yeah.
they ended the streak.
That's right. But the fact that they would have run that ball back like that, that made St. Mary, and played a wonderful game against them, and just lost by the skin of their teeth. Nobody was expecting that much of an improvement. And because St. Bex were a powerhouse at that time. And so that really would have elevated things. And then was it the next year that they won the Atlantic Ball? Yeah. Because,
64.
Yeah, in the next year, they beat St. FX.
And that ended the 48-game win streak.
And I think, now two teams that played very well against St. Mary's around that time were Stadacona and Shearwater. Sometimes they would place them. They were tough to beat. But then the next year, did St. Mary's lose the first game of the year?
Yes.
Yeah, and then they shut out every other team they played. They scored like 328 points or something to 0, and which was unheard of. And then they won. Who did you play in the for the Atlantic Bowl? McMaster. Well, yeah, that was huge for St. Mary's. They had never done anything like that before.
Michael, we've been referring to St. Mary's teams as the Huskies.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't always the
No.
Huskies.
No, they
When did that change come about?
That change came about with Bob Hayes. He decided that they would have a name. They didn't really have a name. They were just referred to as the Saints, the Santa Marians, or whatever was appropriate for them on that particular day. He decided that they would have a name, and the students voted, and there were at least 8 or 10 names suggested, but the Huskies won by a fairly wide margin. And he got a beautiful husky dog, and he used to have it around the school and on the bench. And I don't know how long he had it, but that was Bob Hayes. He was always promoting the team, doing something, giving it a new persona, and trying to improve things and make it more interesting.
A big part of that persona was defensive football. And in 1963, the Huskies lost their first 2 games. But after that, they put together one of the great defensive strings of all time.
Yeah.
Shut out the opposition in 6 straight games. It hadn't been done prior to that,
No.
and I have my doubts that it'll ever be done again.
No, that's right. I think they outscored the opposition about 328 to 0. I think, was Paul Puma playing on the defense then? I think he was, I'm not sure. But they had Don Murphy, who was sensational, one of the greatest football players that St. Mary's ever had, and Frank Archambault. And they just had and they didn't have, I don't think they had a whole lot of players on that team that year. About 24, 25 football players.
I think it was 27 or 28. I mean, it
okay.
wasn't
Yeah.
as big a team as you would see today.
But they were all good, and they were a very strong team.
They tended to play both ways, offense
right.
and defense.
Yes.
But that made a big difference.
Yeah.
Take me back to that night when the tennis team arrived home.
The tennis team, made up of Jim Scriven and Paul Napier and Frank Nolan, arrived back at St. Mary's to a royal welcome. They had trumpets and bass drums and several hundred students and friends, and they had, it was considered to be a wonderful achievement for St. Mary's at that time. They were just getting off the ground in sports. It was their first year on Robie Street, and that sort of set the pace for the next few years. They didn't have all that much success every night, but they were always competitive, and the St. Mary's teams always put everything they had in whatever they were doing,
The Huskies, we keep referring to St. Mary's, But they weren't always the Huskies. When did they become the Huskies?
They became the Huskies, I believe, in 1958. Up until then, they were known as the Saints or the Centenarians or whatever the reporters wanted to refer to them as on that particular day. And Bob Hayes thought they should have a name, a tag or whatever, and he had an election. They voted on what the name would be, and Huskies was the best, seen as being the best choice from about 8 or 9 other names. And then he got a beautiful husky dog that he had around the school and on the bench of the football team, and that was very popular as well.
When Bob Hayes became the Huskies football coach and athletic director, the football program, which was dear to his heart, really began to take shape.
Yeah.
And by 1963, they lost their first 2 games. But after that, they won 6 in a row,
Right.
and limited the opposition to 0 points.
Yes.
Hadn't been done before,
Right.
and it hasn't been done since.
Yeah. No, he did have a great defensive team. One of the things that Bob Hayes started to do when he came here, he didn't just go to the United States to recruit players, he went to QEH. And up until then, and not a lot of guys from QEH came to St. Mary's, but he went over, he got Dan Scaling, who just came here as a young guy out of high school, and he became a terrific football player, terrific lineman. I'm not sure if he got Roy Velmirovich as well. He played on the hockey team. He played football at least 1 year. I'm not sure if he was on that team, but he was from QEH. And they had Jim Crane, who was one of the best linemen they ever had, and Butch Burke, who had come up from New England with the first wave of Americans, and
Bobby Rutolo.
Bobby Rutolo. Yes, I bought my history book for 50 cents from Bobby Rutolo when I first arrived at St. Mary's in my first year. He was as solid as a rock for 4 years for St. Mary's. Yeah, overall they had a great defense.
The following year, 64, they would win the very first Atlantic Bowl. What are your memories of that afternoon at Wanderers Ground against Minnesota?
As far as I can remember, it was a very rainy day. And to tell you the truth, I wasn't at the game. So I can't tell you too much about it. But to be quite honest with you, I used to go to all the games, but...
You missed that one.
Actually, I asked this girl who I had the biggest crush on to the football game. And it was a terrible day. And I phoned her, I said, look, I can't take you to a football game on a day like this. And she thought, yeah, that's probably not a good idea to go. And I said, the heck with it, I'm not going. I didn't bother going to the football game, I felt too bad. But anyway, that's why I didn't go to the football game.
After 64, I want to move ahead a little bit in the football years. The national championship wouldn't start in 64, but by 73, St. Mary's would win its first national football championship. Can you recall that era?
Yes. Well, I remember Kenny Clark, I believe, the punter. He was sensational. And Robinson, I think, was the quarterback, and he threw a lot of touchdown passes. And there were huge crowds at St. Mary's because then they had the stadium. And overall, I think Al Keith was the coach of the team. And they just had and Santucci, I believe, was the running back. And they just had a very solid, exciting team to watch. And there was tremendous enthusiasm at St. Mary's at that time for the football. And that was a real achievement for St. Mary's to win the football championship. And I think, was that the year they won the basketball as well?
Yes.
That was, and I think they lost the hockey by 1 goal, the national championship, to the University of Toronto that year.
Why do you think athletics all of a sudden came together? The hockey team, the football team, the basketball team became national contenders almost year after year.
I'll tell you, one of the reasons I think was because with Hayes was the coach. He came here as the big star, as the hero, the conquering hero, but he didn't have to be the star all the time. He went out and he recruited good coaches. Instead of, he worked for a while as the hockey coach, and 1 year they came within 1 game of defeating I believe in 1959, they came within one game of defeating St. FX for the college championship, and he was the coach that year. And they used to practice, they had a lot of practices in the gymnasium, where he set up this system where they could do dry land training with hockey nets and all this sort of thing. But anyway, they had a good hockey team. But he had gone out and Al Keefe he saw something. Al Keefe was a good all-around athlete and very popular and respected. And he was obviously a good coach. And he got, I believe, Heaney to coach the basketball team. And of course, everybody knows his background. He was a big star. And Bob Boucher was recruited to be the hockey coach. They were all stars in their own rights. And they became very good coaches, very effective coaches. But basically, the main reason Bob Hayes went out, he got good coaches for the teams. He was sort of, to some extent, in the background, working the strings, but he let the other guys do the coaching.
What was the atmosphere like on campus in those years, the 60s, 70s, in terms of support for the teams?
Well, I wasn't here in the 70s. I was here in the 60s. I always thought there was really good support for the teams. When I was here from 64 to 69. For a lot of that time, they didn't have a hockey team. But when they did get the hockey team, it was very well supported. We had the rink, and people they packed it. The hockey team was much better than anybody thought it was going to be, with Boucher coaching them. And he had some good local players. And he had some guys from the Junior Canadians. He had Brian O'Byrne from the Junior Canadians, and he had Roddy Bossy from the Junior Canadians. He had Bobby Woods and Mike Hornby. They were local guys. I think Jimmy Moore. He had a lot of good local players. Daryl Maxwell, I think, from Truro. He had a solid team, and they were very, I'm not sure if they won the championship the first year, but with the basketball, Les Goodwin was here coaching the basketball team. He recruited him from New Jersey. He came here with an outstanding record. There's another example of him. He had preceded Brian Heaney, but Frank Baldwin had left to look after the Canadian Martyrs Center, and Goodwin, boy, he did some recruiting. There was only one Canadian on the team. The rest were all from New Jersey and Philadelphia and these places. But he had Joe O'Reilly and Jimmy Daniels and Al Brown and all those guys, exciting basketball players. And at the same time, there were other very strong teams in the league at that time. Acadia were very strong, and Al Yar had a very strong team at Dalhousie. They were great rivals, St. Mary's and Dalhousie at that time. And the gym used to be packed. If St. Mary's were playing at Dalhousie, I can remember when a St. Mary's person couldn't get in to see that game because all the Dal fans wanted to go. When they paid their tuition, they got a ticket for all the sporting events, and the Dal, Al Yar and whoever was running the sports at Dalhousie at that time figured how could they keep the Dal fans away and give tickets to the St. Mary's fans. He was a good sportsman and everything, Al Yar. So anyway, I can remember they used to, one year during the playoffs, they relented and gave 50 tickets to the St. Mary's fans, and what they did was they put up a dartboard, and they had Al Yar's picture as the bullseye, and if you could get a bullseye, you get a ticket to the basketball game. But I mean, everybody wanted to go to those games. George Hughes was playing, I think Eric Durnford for Dalhousie. They had a very good team, and it was just tooth and nail. Every game with Dalhousie was a bitter fight. But and the football team, seems to me they had really big crowds over on the home field here at St. Mary's in the 1960s. That's the way I recall it. Very good student support.
How about the role that the Jesuits might have played?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way of underestimating the role that the fathers made in terms of an impact on athletics?
Well, in my time, the first Jesuit that I saw coaching here, I would say overall, yeah, they didn't seem to be interested in sports. When I was in grade 9 at St. Mary's High School, they would have had the intramural programs, and we had football, hockey, baseball, basketball, and I had Father Walsh as my homeroom teacher. He seemed to be very interested in sports and knew what was going on, and Father Peckham, he was a Latin teacher. I can remember him, watching him hit a baseball out there on the campus. And of course, Father McGilvery was a very much respected and much loved hockey player here. He played for the Halifax St. Mary's Juniors in the late 40s. He was from Cape Breton. And he played on the same line with Huey Campbell and Bert Hirschfeld. And of course, Douglas McNeil played on that team as well. He was a terrific defenseman. And Bert Hirschfeld went on to play on the same line as Rocket Richard for the Montreal Canadiens. But they were a tremendously competitive hockey team for several years. They didn't win any Memorial Cups, but they competed well for them. And they packed they had many huge crowds at the Halifax Forum. And Elmer McGilvery wasn't a big guy, but he was a feisty guy, one of these hockey players who would go into the corners and fight for everything. At least that's what people would tell me about him. I didn't see him play. But he came, and then he played in the Nova Scotia Senior Hockey League with the St. Mary's team. And this was not a St. Mary's University team. They were called the Halifax St. Mary's Juniors. They were run by a guy who had graduated from St. Mary's, but he had guys from QE8, St. Pat's, guys who were working in automobile shops, and students from St. Mary's. It was a real mix, and the city was really behind them. But anyway, so he was a great favorite, and the students really liked him as a teacher, and he obviously was quite a sportsman. And first time I came to see a St. Mary's hockey game, or a hockey game, I can remember my brother taking me up to the Halifax Forum. He was in grade 9, 1956, 1957. St. Mary's in the high school hockey league, and they used to have a doubleheader at the Forum every Friday night. QEH, Vocational, St. Pat's, and St. Mary's, and they used to get big crowds up there. So he took me up. He was going up with his friends, and I thought that was great to see the hockey. I'd never been to hockey games before, and I went up every Friday night after that. And Father McGilvery was the coach of the high school team. And then he took me one afternoon to see St. Mary's College play Acadia at the Forum. And Father McGilvery was the coach. And that was the first time I would have seen a game at the college level. And so Father McGilvery would have coached maybe for another year or two. And then when Bob Hayes came, he coached both the hockey and football team, much to the joy, I'm sure, of Father McGilvery. And then the Jesuits, they would go to the games. Most of the time you'd see them there, and they seemed to be interested. Although I don't ever remember them talking about sports too much, or the college teams or high school teams in the class or anything like that. But maybe at noontime or during breaks they might discuss hockey with kids. But they seemed to be quite. They were all for sports, I would say.
You've been a lifelong St. Mary's fan. You've probably seen more games than anybody else that I can think of. Do you still have that passion for Husky sports?
Well, I had more passion when I was a kid because St. Mary's, they were the underdogs starting off. They were the little school that was trying to catch up to St. FX and Dalhousie, or even Mount A, which wasn't a big school, but was really good in sports, UNB. And then they got to be as good as the others, and then you can go to the games and enjoy their success. I saw lots of great basketball games at the Forum, at the Metro Center, lots of great hockey games and football games. Watching them play at the top level in Canada in the football year after year was really quite a thing to see. I didn't enjoy it when they'd win by 100 points. I couldn't get excited over that. But I'll tell you, one of the things I found most exciting in the last couple of years was a couple of weeks ago, I was at the at the opening of the new rink. It was on a Saturday afternoon, probably 2 weeks ago. And I thought, well, I might go, and the girls were gonna play at 3 o'clock, and the men were gonna play at 7 o'clock. And so I thought, well, since it's the opening of the rink, I should go over and maybe I'll watch the girls play for the first period. So I went over. Well, geez, I was really impressed with the girls playing. They were terrific. And so they were playing UPEI, and both of the teams, they could really skate, really good skaters, and they were trying so hard, both of them. The hockey was so intense. They were so focused on what they were doing. Their positional play was really good. And they were so competitive, but they were having a hard time finishing off their play sometimes. It was only 1 goal scored, and UPEI won 1-0, but I stayed for the whole game. After watching the first period, I thought, geez, I can't leave this game. There were other people there too. There were only maybe 150, 200 people there. But it was a really well-played game. They just focused on hockey. Now the guys play a good game too, but a lot of the games you see on the NHL, level and all that, there's so much pushing, shoving, these scrimmages that waste time. I timed the girls' game. They played the game, including the intermissions, 2 hours and 5 minutes, because they just stuck to hockey. And I was really impressed. And I was really sticking up for St. Mary's in that game. I wanted to see them score a goal. And I was disappointed when they lost. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to come back the next game. I want to at least see them score a goal. I'm going to have the satisfaction of seeing them score. But all of those girls, I admired the way they played hockey.
That might be one of the biggest single differences between your early years as a Husky fan and today, is the inclusion of women's athletics.
Oh, sure.
And St. Mary's has been at the forefront
Yes.
in terms of putting together women's teams that have become very competitive.
Oh yeah, he encouraged that. And a couple of years ago, I was driving between, it was around supper time, and I was driving between the Wanderers grounds and the gardens. And I noticed, oh yeah, I remembered there's a doubleheader going on in there in soccer tonight. That was before they had the professional team. The new stadium was just opening up. The St. Mary's girls were playing the Dalhousie girls in soccer, and then the men were playing the men. And I thought, geez, I should go in and see some of that. But I didn't think I'd get a parking spot, but there was one parking space by the cemetery. And I thought, oh geez, I'm gonna park over there, I'm gonna go and see some of this. I'm gonna see what the stadium is like, because as a kid, I used to go over there. We used to sell in the bleachers there when I was 11 years old. We used to sell pop for Bill Hartman's Canteen, and I'd go to all the HUD League games, and I've seen the St. Mary's football teams over there, and all kinds of sporting events there. And so I went over, and it was around 6 o'clock or 6:30, and the St. Mary's girls were playing the Dalhousie girls soccer. And I thought, they were playing with such intensity. I mean, that's the guys over the years in college sports. Naturally, they had to play with intensity to be competitive, and that would be the basketball, the football, the hockey, all of them. But I hadn't ever remembered seeing many girls' games. But when I saw how intense these girls were, they were putting everything into the soccer, and it looked dangerous, some of the things they were doing. Kicking at the 2 or 3 kicking at the ball at the same time and stuff like that, or just diving at stuff. They were putting everything into it, and I was really impressed with the way they were playing the sports. And I only stayed for about an hour because it started to get cold, and I didn't have a jacket or anything. So a week later, I came down. I thought, if that's the way the girls play, I'd love to see the way the men play. I hadn't seen the men play since I would have gone to St. Mary's. So I came down here one afternoon, on a Saturday afternoon, and the St. Mary's girls were playing the ex-girls. So I watched a half of that, and then I stayed for the men's game. And oh my gosh, the way the men played soccer, it looked dangerous, really. I mean, they put so much into it, and they were so skilled. It's quite amazing. But I think it has a lot to do with, the way some of these guys and girls have grown up from the time they were small. being taught how to play and playing in lakes from the time they were so small and young. They really are skilled, and so it's it's still fun to watch. You know.
One final question. So many years, so many teams, so many athletes. Is there one athlete, one event on this campus, St. Mary's, that stands out above and beyond all the others?
Well, yeah, as far as the athletes are concerned, right from the start, when I always liked playing goalie when I was a kid. Ground hockey or ice hockey, not that I played a lot of ice hockey, but we played whenever we could. We didn't have so many opportunities, but we played a lot of ground hockey. But I always was drawn to be the goalie, and I always watched the goalies. And Reggie McDougall for St. Mary's. First time I came to see the game with my brother, they were playing Acadia, and Father McGilvery was the coach, and Reggie McDougall was the goalie. And I thought, wow, he was great to watch, and he was very good for the team. And so anytime, and I went to just about every hockey game after that for a few years. And especially over at the Dalhousie rink. It was a great place to watch hockey at the Dal rink. And St. Mary's often used that as their home rink. And you could stand up in the back overlooking down at the goaltender. But Reggie McDougall was a backbone of the St. Mary's hockey teams. They had other good players too. But one year he was the athlete of the year. He also was a good defensive back on the football team. But I really loved watching him, and I always cheered for him. And then he played in the Nova Scotia Senior Hockey League for Halifax and Windsor. And I always thought Reggie McDougall could play anywhere. He was that good. But he probably wasn't as good as maybe I thought he was, but he was really good. And in basketball, Bobby Leahy. I really enjoyed watching Bobby Leahy because one of the things that he's known as, of course, as a shooter, but he could pass the ball. Now you would have seen Bobby Leahy play basketball. He was a terrific shooter, but he would throw passes behind over his shoulder and be the odd one behind his back, right into the hands of these guys. And I remember one night, they had Joe O'Sullivan or Jim O'Sullivan, they had the O'Sullivan twins on the basketball team, and one night he threw him the ball, and poor O'Sullivan got it right in the nose because he just wasn't expecting it. But I mean, Leahy put it right into his hands, but sometimes he'd surprise him, but he was very, very good. I can remember, I often sat with Jimmy Daniels, in class, and he was a terrific player for St. Mary's in the basketball team. And Joe O'Reilly was another one. When he was hot at all, he could shoot the lights out. But Jimmy Daniels was so good under the basket, and he could jump. And Mickey Fox, of course, as time went on, he'd be playing those games up at the Forum at the Metro Center in front of big crowds. And I taught school later on, and I was teaching at one time at Goresbrook Junior High School. And they brought Mickey Fox in to speak to the kids. And they started this thing off. They took about 300 kids from Goresbrook School, junior high kids, put them all in the gymnasium. They're all around the walls. They had the floor, most of it was open. And they gave Mickey Fox this big build-up about, who he was, who he had played, what he had accomplished as a basketball player. He was there to talk to them about drugs and things like that, I guess. I forget exactly what he spoke about. But anyway, he was going to give a shooting exhibition before he gave his speech. And he took shots. Now, you know what those junior high students could be like. Some of them, they couldn't wait to see a guy like him miss a shot or two or three in a row. Some of the kids, I know they'd be very supportive of him, but I know some of them, that's just the way they were at that age. Well, I don't think he missed a shot. He took shots from everywhere, half court. He might have missed one or two shots. It was an amazing display of shooting. And I met him a couple of weeks ago for the first time, and I told him that he had given one of the most amazing shooting exhibitions that I had ever seen. And it was that day at Goresbrook, and he remembered that day. But that to me was, talk about performing under pressure. I don't know how much pressure he felt exactly, but I think he would have felt a little bit, but he was impressive. And on that same night, it was at a get-together that John Murphy, former player at St. Mary's, gave for former basketball players at his house. And he had invited me to it. And he also had a tape of the game between Acadia and St. Mary's in 1973 at the Metro Center when they had 10,000 people and St. Mary's won the Canadian Championship. Now, I was in charge of now I used to go to a lot of the St. Mary's basketball games. And one of the first game I ever saw was probably in 1957. My brother was in grade 9, 56, 57. He would have taken me down to St. Mary's play Acadia in the playoffs. And I can remember this because I just read it the other day in the book that I have. But all three games, it was 2 out of 3. I saw a couple of them down at the St. Mary's gym. They were tremendously exciting. The place was packed. The fans were so intense and cheering. I've never really seen anything like this in sport. And Acadia won the series 2-1. They outscored St. Mary's 162 to 161. And all 3 games, they were all sellouts. 800 would be the capacity at St. Mary's. But that was my introduction to basketball, really. At that level, I had seen one game before that with St. Mary's and Dalhousie during a regular season game. But then I was in charge of the hospitality or whatever as a school teacher in the school, and they were having a staff party that night of that basketball game, and I had organized the staff party. So I had seen the semifinal games, but I couldn't go to the Metro Center game that night between St. Mary's and Acadia because I had to be responsible for the party. And but at John Murphy's house that night, he had it taped, the whole video that as it was on television, and I saw it for the first time, and it was sensational. That would be the game of the that game in basketball. As far as football was concerned, well, some of those games when Blake Nill was coaching, when they were playing the best teams from the West and from the East, I don't know which one. The one that when the guy from Dartmouth from Preston made the catch over in the end zone, running, he was just over the goal line, he was looking over his shoulder, and it had just a few seconds left in the game to win the game for St. Mary's. And the game when Santucci led them down at the stadium too, when it was a broadcast all across Canada, and St. Mary's, I don't know who they were playing, Waterloo or somebody, but it was a sensational game. One of those games, and also the game against Dalhousie, of course, when they lost 21-7 or whatever, but they played a great game against them, Grave Cliff McClear made those runs. But I would have to take one of the games when they were playing for the highest stakes, with Nill. But I couldn't pick one out. And for the hockey, well, that Smith one, he scored the goal in overtime. I was watching on television. They won the Canadian Championship. That was really something for St. Mary's to go all the way and win the championship in hockey. And I can remember when I was in the 9th grade, going down to the gym, and Hayes had all these things set up so they could practice their shooting and all this stuff, because he was improvising once again, and he had a good hockey team that year. They beat Dalhousie in the semifinals over at the Memorial Rink at Dalhousie, and then they beat St. X in the first game here. There was a 2-game total point, and they beat X in the first game, but then they lost down at St. X, so they didn't win the championship. That's about as much as I can narrow it down. As far as football is concerned, I'd have to pick of all the players, I'd have to say Greg McClear, because I saw him play for like 6 or 7 years at St. Mary's. He played when he was a high school student, played 4 years of university, and then he got a year of after graduation, and he was just a workhorse for St. Mary's. He scored more touchdowns than anybody else who ever played for St. Mary's. So, and when you're a kid, you really look up to these guys more, so. Anyway, if I had narrowed it down, that's about as much as I could do. Plus, Mr. Puma, I have to give you, and you
Thank
did a
you,
good
sir.
job, Steve.